The New York Times depicting a, quote, growing alarm among some Democrats about a, quote, 70-something candidate from outside the party structure, immune to intimidation or incentive, with an unwavering base. It also quotes a centrist Clinton insider, Howard Wolfson, saying, people underestimate the possibility of Sanders becoming the nominee at their own peril.
So that was Ari Melber on MSNBC talking about the New York Times article that stated that certain establishment Democrats are plotting on how to stop Bernie Sanders from actually winning the Democratic nomination in 2020, because they're finally realizing what everybody in the American public, especially progressives, have realized since 2016, that Bernie Sanders is a beyond viable candidate, and he represents the American public's interest way better than any other establishment Democrat does or any Republican does, and that if you give him a chance to make his case to even people that are more on the conservative side of things, like people in the Midwest that voted for Donald Trump, that he'll actually be able to win those people over way better than somebody in the establishment Democrat wing can. So people saw how viable of a candidate Bernie Sanders was all the way back in 2016. That's why he finally ended up getting enough momentum to even make a challenge at Hillary Clinton in that primary. So the establishment stayed in their bubble and laughed it off as a bunch of naive progressives and quote-unquote Bernie bros that they always used to say as kind of a smear piece. They still do use that term all the time to say that it's just a bunch of white men that are sexist and racist that want Bernie Sanders to win, even though that couldn't be further from the truth. But that's just one of the smear tactics that they use. So they continue to laugh in their bubble and be smug about it and act like Bernie Sanders had no chance. And now we're getting to grind time. And now Bernie Sanders is still leading in most of the polls. He basically every poll that comes out nowadays, Bernie Sanders is leading in. He's leading in the newest polls that came out over Joe Biden still. And he's easily leading over people like Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. So I think they're finally starting to realize, hey, what do we got here? Do we have anybody that's actually going to be able to beat Bernie Sanders? Do we have anybody that's even remotely as popular, despite all of the establishment propaganda and all of the propping up that mainstream media and the establishment has done for people like Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris and Beto O'Rourke? And they're finally realizing, we may not be able to do anything to stop this. But I can tell you right now, they're going to try everything they can to try and stop this. So get ready for them to pull out every stupid, slimy establishment trick in the book to try and stop them. But they're trying to plot these things up right now. Nothing has really worked at all yet because there's nothing that they can get on Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders is a squeaky clean politician. He just released 10 years of tax returns and still nothing that they can get at him for. They tried to do that framing of that he's in the 1%, and isn't that hypocritical that he always talks about the 1% and the millionaires and the billionaires, and everybody looked at that and was like, this is clearly just another smear tactic, because he's voting against his own self-interest all the time then, which even makes it more admirable. Makes it even more admirable that he's voting for these policies, because it would be in his self-interest to vote for all of these tax cuts to be able to give the rich more money, but he votes against them. Why? Because he actually cares about the American public, and the American public realizes that he cares about them, and that's why they support him, or an overwhelming majority of people do support him, and that's why he's looked at so favorably by a majority of Americans. But let's dive into this New York Times article by Jonathan Martin. I just want to pull a few more excerpts out of there just to show you what exactly is going on. So the main culprits, if you will, of these meetings are Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Terry McAuliffe, the dreaded Neera Tanden for the Center for American Progress, which is basically just like a corporate Democrat think tank, basically, and basically a corporate Democrat propaganda arm. So, and also everybody's favorite new guy, what about Pete Buttigieg, is also involved in these meetings as well. So let's dive into this New York Times article a little bit, and I'll break it down a little bit more, and then I'll show you the last part of that Ari Melber piece of what Bernie Sanders has done in reaction to that piece in the New York Times coming out. So the headline of the New York Times article is "Stop Sanders. Democrats are agonizing over his momentum." Some members of the Democratic establishment, resentful over 2016 and worried about a divided 2020 primary, are beginning to ask how to thwart Senator Bernie Sanders. When Leah Daughtry, a former Democratic Party official, addressed a closed-door gathering of about 100 wealthy liberal donors in San Francisco last month, all it took was a review of the 2020 primary rules to throw a scare in them. The matter of what to do about Bernie and the larger imperative of party unity has, for example, hovered over a series of previously undisclosed Democratic dinners in New York and Washington organized by the longtime party financier Bernard Schwartz. The gatherings have included scores from the moderate or center-left wing of the party, including Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the minority leader, former Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia, Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, himself a presidential candidate, and the president of the Center for American Progress, Neera Tanden. There's a growing realization that Sanders could end up winning this thing, or certainly that he stays in so long that he damages the actual winner, said David Brock, the liberal organizer who said he had discussions with other operatives about an anti-Sanders campaign and believes it should commence, quote, sooner rather than later. So as somebody on the left, on one hand, you feel great about that because the establishment is borderline just shaking in their boots at this point. So they're scared. They know that Bernie Sanders has a wave of momentum coming into this primary and that he has staunch, steadfast support from his base. And that base makes up a majority of the Democratic Party now. That's this progressive base. That is what the Democratic Party has to represent. And Bernie Sanders represents that. But people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer don't represent what their base wants. And they don't represent what a majority of the party wants anymore. So they're nervous and they're scared and they're trying to figure out ways to package themselves and candidates that are running for the establishment side of things in 2020 in a way that can beat Bernie Sanders. But I genuinely think they're just flailing out because what do they have? They've tried to, there's been so many establishment smears and hit pieces that have gone on. Even back in 2016, they were happening and they've continued ever since then. About him not being a Democrat, about why hasn't he released his tax returns yet? Then he releases his tax returns, and it turns out that his book did well, and that he's been making over $100,000, obviously, because that's his Senate salary for God knows how long, and he's been making that for over a decade. So the fact that they're talking about Bernie Sanders being in the 1%, well, no duh. Of course he's in the 1%. Everybody knew that supported him. Or if they didn't think that he had over $1 million, they knew he obviously had to be very close to that. So it's just simple math. But then they think they have another gotcha there. They try and just pick on the hackiest, smallest little things because that's all they have to pick on. So they continually will try and pick at these things. And then there's plenty of progressive media outlets and independent media outlets and just more than enough independent thinkers who are progressive that see right through all these hit pieces and smear tactics that they're trying to go at Bernie Sanders with. So it's clearly not working. It clearly has not worked since 2016. Maybe to some people that are like Clintonite, just die-hard centrist Democrat supporters, which I think that number is really very few when you go down to the actual. There may be people that identify as moderate Democrats, but then you ask them, do you support Medicare for all? Yes. Do you support tuition-free public college? Yes. Do you support a Green New Deal? Yes. So they may say they're moderate, but that's just because titles get so convoluted these days anyway. So the overwhelming majority of the party supports policies like what I just mentioned, the Medicare for all, Green New Deal, tuition-free public college. So you have all of the investment in infrastructure. So you have all of these policies that a majority of Democrats support. Not only a majority of Democrats, a majority of Americans support. And Bernie Sanders represents those. People like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer don't represent those anymore. And all these establishment Democrats and the people at Center for American Progress like Neera Tanden, they don't represent that at all. So now, like even Pete Buttigieg the other day, he tries to come off as being this more progressive guy, and all of these establishment media outlets try and push him that way. All mainstream media is trying to be like, well, what about Pete? And Beto O'Rourke was the Pete Buttigieg before Pete Buttigieg, and then Kamala Harris was basically the savior for the establishment Democrats before those two came along. So they constantly keep trying to parrot these guys, and they constantly keep trying to push these guys out into the mainstream and just completely jam the airwaves with people like Pete Buttigieg and Beto O'Rourke. And then anytime they do cover Bernie Sanders, it's something like about Bernie Sanders not releasing his tax returns, or that Medicare for All would cost some scary number, when they don't include the fact that there's a study that they're quoting that says that Medicare for All would cost this crazy number. It actually also says that Medicare for All would save $2 trillion over 10 years compared to our current system. So it's just nonstop smears on Bernie Sanders' end. It's all negative stuff. And then all of a sudden you have Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg, where they're doing all this glorious coverage over him and talking about how he's, in Pete Buttigieg's case, that he speaks over 8 languages and that he's gay. And they try and come at it from this identity politics / well-educated type of thing. I saw this terrible MSNBC clip the other day where they were just raving. It was Chuck Todd and a few of these other MSNBC people. And they were just, oh my God, it was unbearable. It was cringeworthy just to watch, because they were just talking about Pete Buttigieg. And they were like, well, maybe if Donald Trump is like reality TV, maybe Pete Buttigieg can be the high-end TV to people interested in politics and voters. Maybe he can be the Game of Thrones to Donald Trump's reality TV. And it's like, do you guys not get what the American people want at all right now? Do you guys not get what the Democratic base is fighting for every day? What media hosts like me and all the other progressive media hosts are talking about every single day, and why there's so much attention being paid to independent media instead of mainstream media now? It's because we actually talk about the policies and what these politicians represent and what the American people want done. But they don't cover that. They just cover, well, what about Pete Buttigieg going to Harvard and speaking 8 languages and being gay? Isn't he amazing? Don't you want him to be the next president? Isn't he the exact opposite of Donald Trump in terms of his personality? But they don't get that it's not just a personality contest anymore. It is about getting progressive policies through. The policies that a majority of Americans support, because it would help the majority of Americans. So they just don't get it, and they're continually stuck in their bubble, and they've been this way for God knows how long at this point. They've been there forever now. And finally, it's starting to really creep in that they're like, you know what? This guy may actually take us down. Bernie Sanders may actually get the nomination, even though we laughed it off and smugly waved him away and waved his supporters away and dismissed them as nothing more than some naive bunch of Bernie bros and this far left part of the party that doesn't represent mainstream America. But actually, our policies do represent mainstream America. So get ready to be shell-shocked. I know they're finally starting to realize, slimy donors like David Brock are finally starting to realize that Bernie Sanders is really probably going to win this thing. I know I'm predicting that Bernie Sanders is going to win the Democratic primary. And I think definitely if he wins the Democratic primary, I'm almost positive that he would beat Donald Trump in the general election. I think he would walk all over him in the debates. And I think Bernie Sanders is going to walk all over these establishment Democrats. People like Pete Buttigieg, he can speak as many languages as he wants. Unless he comes out for Medicare for All and a Green New Deal and public tuition-free public college, progressives aren't going to support Pete Buttigieg just because he went to Harvard and spoke all of these languages. They just aren't in touch with reality of what the voters want in this Democratic establishment anymore. And they've been out of touch for a while, and finally it's coming back to haunt them. And I cannot wait to continuously watch this happen in real time as they continually get more and more scared and flail out with more and more smears and more hit pieces and being more and more disingenuous. But that's all they have left, because Bernie Sanders is squeaky clean, and they've tried every hit piece they can on him already that's even remotely, I don't even want to say pertinent, because they're not, but they're trying to get the things that they think at least could be gotchas that they could try and frame in a way that could get them. But even those things aren't working. So what do they have left now? Basically to either just try and cheat or to just let it happen. And they can try their best, but it's going to happen anyway. So I think this is great news from that perspective. Obviously, it's still frustrating news in the fact that you have this Democratic establishment and people like Neera Tanden going and having these weird dinners where they're trying to plot against him and trying to figure out other ways where they can run this anti-Bernie Sanders campaign and smear him more in the public eye and run more hit pieces on him. But they've already continuously tried that for so long, and it hasn't worked. And there's media outlets like myself and plenty of other people like Secular Talk and Majority Report, TYT, Jimmy Dore, who else? There are so many more. I'm forgetting plenty. David Pakman. You have all of these progressive outlets that are going to push back on these narratives by the mainstream media, and we already have been. And there are so many people that are well educated to the framing enough at this point and know who Bernie Sanders is and what he stands for and what the smears are, that they see right through them. So the smears aren't working, the hit pieces aren't working, and they don't have anything else but to do those. So they're running out of options, and they're definitely scared. And as somebody who's progressive, you have to be so happy to see that they're really on a run at this point, and that they're finally realizing that they have to scramble and flail out the best they can to try and keep Bernie Sanders out of here. And they're going to try, and it's going to be frustrating to continuously see these smears and hit pieces. But like I said, this is all for the greater good at this point. Let's continue to push back against all of these smears and false narratives that mainstream media and the establishment Democrats will try and push to try and be anti-Bernie. And let's just make this happen, guys. Oh, and before I forget, here is Ari Melber, just with one more clip on how Bernie Sanders is reacting to that Stop Sanders article about all these establishment Democrats trying to figure out a way to stop him.
What does the Sanders campaign think about this New Times piece? Well, they're already fundraising off it, with Sanders' campaign manager emailing supporters, quote, "The Democratic establishment's terrified of our movement, as they should be."
You gotta love that, don't you? They're running scared, and Bernie Sanders is fundraising off of them just flailing out at the moment. So, as somebody on the left, like I said, I'm sure all of the audience is just loving this. Bernie Sanders making money off of the establishment, trying to do all these backroom plots to try and smear him and have this anti-Sanders campaign. And he's just going to be like, all right, now you're going to be exposed as how corrupt and how hacky and establishment biased you really are. I'm just going to fundraise off of you. And it's just such a baller move. I know it's so weird for a political commentary for me to say baller move, but it's a baller move because Bernie Sanders is just saying, they're running scared. I got him running scared. Come support me. Let's finish him off. Thank you for watching that clip of Plutocracy today. If you are not a subscriber yet to the channel, I would highly recommend going down below and hitting the subscribe button. Also hit the bell so that way you're notified anytime I put up a new video. And also, if you would like to donate to the show, I'm fully running off of audience support at the moment. So if you could just go to Venmo at SeanCassella, that's SeanCassella, and you can donate anything you want there. It could be $1, could be $10, could be 2 cents. Whatever you can donate, I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to be talking to you all soon.